Hi everyone, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're waiting for a few more people to log in. Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Some of you are probably in the session via our Zoom link that we sent out, and some of you are probably viewing through YouTube and Twitch. So whatever system you're on, in the chat, you can type in your questions, and our resident tech expert's going to kind of keep track of that and relay those to me as we go. Tonight we're doing the financial aid finding college scholarships. It's the last workshop of our series for navigating the whole college application process. This is probably the least fun one to talk about and the most important. So college is getting really expensive, and so we're hoping to help everyone kind of figure out the best way for them to finance their college education. So again, we've kind of talked about this in previous sessions. You really want to research your colleges early on and have a good idea of the schools you're interested in. So many colleges and universities have very different policies on financial aid, whether they offer only need-based aid, whether or not they offer merit aid. They have very different deadlines for financial aid. And so it's a good idea to research in advance and at least have narrowed down by your junior year, narrowing down your choices to 10 or 20 schools so that you can really look in depth with those schools and start talking to the financial aid folks at those schools about what their policies and deadlines might be so that you can be prepared when it comes time to apply. We talked about this a little bit last time. The common application opens August 1st. You really want to get in there and get started on your essays and look at which colleges, again, you're planning to apply to and what are their application deadlines. Their application deadlines to get into the school and the application deadlines for financial aid are not necessarily the same. And although it seems counterintuitive, there are a number of schools who, for example, will allow you to apply regular admission anytime from August 1st when the application opens through to, for example, some point in time in January when their application closes for that particular school, but they may have a lot of financial aid available with deadlines in November or December. So if you don't apply until January and you haven't looked at the financial aid deadlines, you can still get into the school, but you've lost out on a lot of financial aid opportunities at that particular school. So again, research the colleges in advance, know those deadlines, work on your common application and make sure you get that in on time to kind of meet those deadlines so that that application and your financial aid applications are in when you need them to be in so that you are considered for as much financial aid as possible. The SAT and ACT, there are scholarships available whether you've taken those tests or not. And I know for a lot of athletes, this past year, the NCAA waived SAT requirements for athletes because of COVID. And some schools waived the ACT or SAT application requirements because of COVID as well. And with the ongoing situation with the virus, that may continue for the next application year. Additionally, some schools are making the SAT and ACT optional for the admissions process. But there are a number of scholarships available where those scholarship committees will consider your SAT and or ACT scores when selecting scholarship recipients. So even if the NCAA, when it's time for you to apply, is not requiring SAT scores, and even if colleges you're interested in are not requiring SAT or ACT scores, you want to start looking in advance and probably take at least one of those tests in advance, so that whether it's required or not for your application and required or not for you to play sports, you can be considered for those scholarships that want to see your test scores. Because if you didn't take the test and you apply for those scholarships, you're at a huge disadvantage for all of these kids who took the test, and the committee can see their scores. The FAFSA is the Federal Financial Aid document. We'll talk about that in a little bit. We'll talk about estimated family contribution, what is the CSS, the different types of funding, all those kinds of things. So again, Common App opens August 1st. Know your dates. You've got to know your dates, not just for the application, but for financial aid as well. So for the SAT and ACT, ideally, you will take that fall or spring of your junior year. So if you're a freshman or sophomore, you've got plenty of time to plan ahead and study. There are lots of test administrations throughout the year. If you're a junior and you have not yet registered for the SAT or ACT, look at the dates and figure out when is a good date for you to test and get on that, get registered, get on that. Every school is a little bit different in terms of how they take scores, but in the event that you take the exam and you don't score as well as you'd hoped, you can retest. As a general rule, you don't want to retake the SAT or ACT 5 times, 6 times, but if you take the SAT and you retake it, that's okay. A lot of schools will super score. So if you score really highly on reading your first round of the SAT and your math isn't so great, and you retake it and your reading is 10 points lower, but your math went way up, a lot of schools will take your highest reading score and your highest math score and combine them. So they won't take one score from a test. They'll combine your highest from the sections. Same with the ACT. Not every school does this, but a lot of them will. So if you do have to retake, then go ahead and retake. We talked about this before. There are a lot of test prep options. Lots of them are free. If you're a really good test taker and you have the time and money, you can take both tests. Or if there are a couple of different scholarships you're interested in and one really prefers the SAT and the other really prefers the ACT, or if you're applying to a college that insists on the ACT and all the others are SAT preferred, that kind of thing, you might have to take both. But if you can get away with just taking one, and a lot of kids can, focus on that one test, register for the one test, study for it, and just go for it. The PSAT, most kids get the opportunity to take the PSAT in high school at no cost, or at reduced cost. But there are a whole lot of high schools that will essentially pay the cost of the test for all of their students. So if you're at one of those schools, for sure, you really should take that test. What a lot of schools do is they will administer it to sophomores, and then they'll administer it again to juniors. Your sophomore test is kind of a freebie. If you do well, great. If you screw it up, nobody cares. Your sophomore scores don't count. The only scores that count are the scores from your junior year. And the reason you might want to take the PSAT is because of national merit scholarships. If you can, your junior year, score within the top 1%, and that's top 1% generally of your state. In some cases, it's a region, depending on how populated the area is. But if you can score within the top 1% of your area, you can become a semifinalist. If you're a semifinalist, you get notified at the beginning of your senior year, and you have to fill out an application. You have to submit academic information, transcripts, that kind of thing. You have to write an essay, and you need a letter of recommendation. After that, if you are selected as a National Merit Scholarship awardee, it's not a huge award. The award itself is only $2,500, although it looks good on your applications. And even though it's only $2,500, there's another benefit. There are a whole lot of schools that are much more generous. So Baylor University, for example, in Texas, if you list when you fill out all your paperwork that Baylor is your first choice school and you are awarded a National Merit Scholarship, Baylor will give you a full tuition ride. So you don't have to pay a penny for tuition at that institution if you're a National Merit Scholar. So even though the scholarship only awards you $2,500, Baylor says, hey, you're great. If you come here, we're going to give you a full ride for tuition. Now, you still have to pay room and board and books, but your entire cost of tuition is covered. University of Louisville, if you're an in-state student, they will give you full in-state tuition plus $32,000 to cover room, board, books, that kind of thing. If you're an out-of-state student, they'll just give you $80,000 as an out-of-state student if you're a National Merit Scholar. And those are just two examples, but there are a lot of schools that will award National Merit Scholars more generously. Some of them will just give you $5,000, $10,000. But there are a lot of schools that are pretty generous to National Merit Scholars. So take the PSAT. If you have any opportunity at all, make sure you take it your junior year, because if you score well enough, it opens up other options for you. If you do well and you become a National Merit finalist, you want to go ahead and look at the schools you're interested in and see, do any of them offer extra packages for National Merit Scholars? The federal financial aid application opens October 1st every year. It's the federal government. These things can always change, but they've been opening October 1st of your senior year every year for at least a decade. So you can pretty much count on that for the foreseeable future. October 1st is when that's going to open. You want to complete it early. Every state has their own deadlines for certain state aid, and you have to have a FAFSA completed before you can be considered for that state aid. Also, different colleges and universities have different deadlines for you to be considered for their financial aid. And private scholarships, some of them, if they're need-based, look at the information from the FAFSA, and they have their own deadlines, and you will not be considered if you have not completed that document before the deadline. So you really need to know the deadlines for your colleges, for private foundations, for whatever state you're in, and make sure you've got that form done before those deadlines. My suggestion to students is always go in on October 1st when it opens, create your account, start filling stuff out, because you can save it. So if you do a little bit at a time and it takes you a week, you're still probably going to get done before any deadlines come up. But if you wait and you wait and you wait, you're going to miss deadlines. On top of that, there are a lot of scholarships available that use the FAFSA that award based on need, first come, first serve. So even if you make the deadline, if enough other people submitted their stuff before you and they're eligible and all of that aid is gone, you're not going to be considered for it because the money's all gone. So keep that in mind too. you really need to get in there and fill it out as soon as possible. You can go to studentaid.gov and kind of look at what they have ahead of time. They also have an early estimator on their website. And so if you go there and you do the early estimator, I will warn you all, nobody is ever happy with what the early estimator tells them, but you essentially put in roughly your family income and a few other bits of information, and it will give you a rough estimate of what your expected family contribution will be. So you have some idea of how much money the government thinks your family should be able to contribute toward your education. And again, like I said, no one's ever happy with that number. And it is a rough estimate when you just do the early estimator, but it gives you a rough idea of what you're looking at. One of the things students, at least in Arizona and nearby states, can consider are WICHE and WUI options. WUI is Western Undergraduate Education, and WICHE is the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Ed. But it's a series of states. Here's the slide will come up that will show you the states that participate. They're all a little bit different, but all of the states that participate in the program, what they do is they agree to give discounted tuition to students from the other states. So every school within the state is a little bit different, and this applies only to public institutions, not private institutions. But for the public institutions, most of the schools in Colorado, for example, instead of paying out-of-state tuition, if you're an Arizona resident and you go into one of those Colorado schools as a WUI student, you pay in-state tuition plus a surcharge, which is usually like 10 or 15%, depending on the school. So it's significantly cheaper than if you apply as an out-of-state student to a state school across the country. So that's something else to consider. The Midwestern states also have a similar program, and there are other regions as well that have some programs. But for those of you in Arizona or nearby states, WUI is a really good option. California, Colorado, and Oregon are highlighted because those three states have public institutions that participate in WUI that have lacrosse teams. So that's always an option for you. If you don't care if you play D1, D2, D3, NAIA, you can go play club lacrosse in Nevada, Utah, you know, places like that where they have good club teams and still pay their discounted tuition. So the estimated family contribution, when you fill out your FAFSA or you do the early estimator, this is what it's giving you. And the estimated family contribution is basically just a number that your school will use to calculate how much financial aid you are eligible to receive at that school. And how it works out is they take the cost of attendance at that particular school. So every school you apply to will do their own calculation. So it'll be the cost of attendance at that particular school. So that's the full tuition rate minus your expected family contribution. And then the number that's left is financial need. And so that's the need-based financial aid you are eligible for. So the CSS is the College Scholarship Service Profile, and that is run by the College Board, the same people that manage the SAT. So the link at the bottom of the slide has their website where you can find the CSS. A lot of colleges use the CSS to award different kinds of aid. It also opens October 1st of your senior year. It asks for a lot of information very similar to the FAFSA. So what I always advise students, start the FAFSA account, same day, start your CSS account, and start putting in that information, both of them. And again, if you do a little bit every day for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is, you'll get it done pretty quickly. And it's not too horrible. You're not stuck sitting there for 6 hours in front of a computer, just dying, trying to put in all this financial information. And again, with the CSS, just like FAFSA, there are different deadlines for different scholarships, different schools. So the sooner you can get it in, the better. No one will ever penalize you for getting it in early, but you can lose out on having access to a lot of money if you do it late. The CSS has about $9 billion in aid every year that they give away to students. So it's really important to fill it out. And again, there are a lot of colleges that determine the need-based scholarships they will give to students based on what you put in the CSS. So you really need to do it. Some schools will go only off of FAFSA, some will go off CSS, some will go off both. But if you want to be eligible for certain types of federal aid, you must do the FAFSA. And there's a lot more aid available with the CSS. So I strongly suggest that all students, when you're ready to apply to college, you do both of these, the FAFSA and the CSS. The CSS also does have a scholarship search. So you can go in there and not just fill in your profile for colleges you're interested in to use to determine what your need-based package might be. You can use it to search for other scholarships that you can apply for outside of what your school offers. So you can look for private scholarships through the CSS. The FAFSA is free to fill out. The CSS is not. So the CSS will cost you $25 for the first school you send the information to, and $16 for every school after that. That's the current rate. They do offer fee waivers. So if you have financial need, the College Scholarship Service will offer fee waivers so kids can send that to different colleges at no cost. So you can look into that as well if you need it. But it's another reason why before you get to your senior year, you want to have narrowed down the number of colleges you're really interested in. Because as you can imagine, it can get really expensive. You don't want to be sending your CSS information to 25, 35, 50 schools. That's ridiculously expensive. But if by the time you're getting ready to do your CSS, you've got things narrowed down to 10 schools, it's much more affordable than if you're trying to send it to 50 schools. So different types of financial aid. Grants don't have to be paid back, and they can be public or private. In the case of federal grants, you fill out the FAFSA, and you can get a Pell Grant if you have sufficient financial need. In the last round, students who their family income was under $50,000 typically got some award. The lower your family income, the greater the award. The maximum award from the 2020-2021 school year, this school year for kids in college, was just over $6,300 for the year. And you fill out the FAFSA every year, and you can be re-eligible for a Pell Grant every year, depending on family income. But the Pell Grant does not have to be paid back. It's money the federal government gives to you to help cover the cost of your education, and you don't have to pay it back. Scholarships, also very similar. They can be public, they can be private scholarships that private foundations put out, or they can be institutional scholarships, so scholarships unique to a particular college. So for any of those, if it's a scholarship, you do not have to pay that money back. Work study is another type of financial aid. Work study, the way it works is you have a job on campus. When you're not working, so if you have a job and things are a little bit slow at your job, you're allowed to study in those jobs. You can kind of sit at your desk and study. But the way those work is the federal government subsidizes the student's hourly pay. So for example, if you have a work study at a particular university that pays $15 an hour, the university is paying half of that and the federal government pays the other half. But it's a job. You don't have to pay any money back because it's a job and you're being paid to do that job. There are some athletes that do work study. It's kind of one of those things you would work out with your coaches. In many cases, Athletes will do work study in their off season and not necessarily in season. But it is an option whether you're an athlete or not. You can do work study and get paid. And that helps offset your living expenses and that kind of thing. There's also student loans, not ideal. All the interest is deferred while you're in school, and then you have 6 months after you get out of school before you have to start paying your loans back, and they can be government subsidized federal loans or they can be private loans. But that money you have to pay back, and you have to pay it back with interest. So when you start applying for colleges and you start looking at the financial aid packages they offer you, loans are the least desirable option. So if you have similar offers and one of them has more scholarships and the other has more loans, the school that's offering you more money in scholarships or even work study tends to be a much better deal than student loans, which you have to pay back. So for athletic scholarships, so that's a type of institutional scholarship because that money is unique to the institution you're going to. They're all a little bit different depending on if it's D1, D2, D3, and depending on sport. So lacrosse is an equivalency sport. It's not a head count sport. So what that means is, for example, if you look at the chart for women, NCAA D1 programs have the equivalent of 12 full ride scholarships. So they have to divide that up. If they have 40 girls on their team, they have to figure out how they want to split 12 full scholarships among 40 girls. And every school is a little bit different how they manage that. But if you play lacrosse, it is, with very few exceptions, pretty much unheard of to get a full ride athletic scholarship. It's not going to happen. Schools typically will not do that. They have too little money to give to too many girls. If you get offered anywhere from 25 to 33%, it's a good offer for athletic money. That's a pretty good deal for a school to offer you that kind of money to play. But they can offer more or less. It will, again, vary from school to school and depending on your talent. D2 only has 10, the equivalent of 10 full ride scholarships that they have to split among their entire team. And it's not per grad year, it's per the entire team. D3 cannot give out athletic money at all. So that's not an option if you go to a D3 school. Most D3 schools, there are a few exceptions, but the majority of D3 schools tend to be private institutions, and they tend to have fairly good financial aid and scholarship departments, and they will offer a lot of need-based aid. Many of them will offer merit aid. So sometimes you can get a really good financial package from a D3 school, even though there's no athletic money. The NJCAA is Junior College Athletic Association, so they have a little more money they can give. And NAIA, how much money they can give is controlled by the schools, not by the organization. So some NAIA schools are very generous and offer a lot of full ride packages to kids, and some are not as generous. So it really depends. But if you're going to play sports in college and you're looking for athletic money, you can still get merit and need-based money. There's a little bit of a change recently. So again, remember, lacrosse is an equivalency sport, not a head count sport. Football is a head count. They have so many full ride scholarships and that's it. They're not split. And lacrosse, the money gets split. As a general rule, the NCAA has not allowed athletic money to be stacked with need-based money. It was either or. But merit aid could be stacked on top of anything. Recently, because of the change in people's financial situation with COVID and just dramatic changes in employment and those kinds of things, the NCAA voted over the summer. And so for equivalency sports only, obviously, because it doesn't make sense for head count sports, you're either getting a full ride scholarship or you're not getting any money at all. So for equivalency sports, where you might be getting partial money, they have decided to allow colleges and students to stack the athletic money that's offered and need-based aid. And only the need-based aid will count toward the sports scholarship limits. So it gives students and schools more flexibility to get students more money without penalizing the schools. So that's unique. It's a D1 decision. I have not heard whether or not D2 is going to do something similar. Again, with D3, it doesn't matter because they don't give out any athletic money, but that does give some more flexibility. When they passed it, they did not put a deadline on it. So it's not just for the next year. They passed it. There's no end point. It doesn't mean they won't change it in the future, but for now, they are allowing a little bit more flexibility with stacking of aid, which is good for students. It's important to keep in mind that some schools, even if they're allowed to give athletic aid or merit aid, do not. So Ivy League schools, for example, so Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Brown, Penn, all those schools, they made a decision as an athletic conference, as a league, a long time ago, that they would not give any athletic money at all. So they're all D1 schools, and they all have the equivalent of 12 full ride athletic scholarships that they can give to women, and they do not give any of them. They give zero athletic money. They've made a decision that they're just not going to do that, that they're educational institutions and they're not giving athletic money. They also give no merit aid. So having good grades is not going to help you. It might help you get into the school. It's not going to get you institutional-based merit aid. Yale, for example, guarantees they will meet 100% of your financial need. So they offer a lot of need-based aid, but they will give no athletic aid and no merit aid. The little Ivies, so schools like Bowdoin, Tufts, those sorts of schools, Amherst, as a league, they also made a decision. Now, they can't give athletic funding anyway because they're all D3, but they also made a decision not to do merit aid and to do strictly need-based aid for students. And many of them have very generous need-based packages, but that's something to keep in mind. So if those schools are, and they typically are fairly expensive, and you really want to go to one of those schools, they will typically meet, most of them will guarantee to meet somewhere between 90 and 100% of your need, demonstrated need. So that's off the estimated family contribution. They determine what your need level is, and they'll meet 90 to 100% of that, most of those schools. If your estimated family contribution is more than your family can really afford, you can still get merit scholarships. You just won't get merit scholarships from the school. So that particular college or university doesn't have any merit scholarships to give you, but you can apply for private scholarships and get all kinds of merit aid. You could end up, for example, if your estimated family contribution comes out that your family is expected to pay $30,000 a year toward your tuition at Brown, and your family can only come up with $10,000, you can go out and apply for private scholarships to cover the difference after you've got your need-based aid from the institution. And theoretically, you could get even more money. So say your parents can afford 10 or 15,000, and the school says you need to come up with 30, you could apply for a lot of scholarships and get $50,000 in private scholarships. There's nothing stopping you from doing that to help cover tuition, room and board, books. And then theoretically, in that case, your parents wouldn't have to pay anything towards your education. But there are schools that will not give institutional merit money. MIT is another one that typically won't do that. Caltech, Stanford, a lot of those schools that are really selective give little to no merit aid. So keep that in mind. If you're interested in those kinds of schools, you're going to be getting need-based aid from the school. And then if you need additional merit-based money, it's going to be private scholarships. So there are a lot of scholarship search sites that you can use to help you figure out what's available out there. And there are a ton. And one of the handouts I'll be emailing to everyone tomorrow has a huge list of really good scholarship search sites where you can search by all kinds of criteria. Some of them are based on major, some of them are based on membership in different organizations, hobbies, you name it. But there are all kinds of scholarships out there, and there are a lot of different search sites that are free that you can go on and find thousands of scholarships. I would suggest not waiting until you're a senior and you're applying to colleges to start looking, because there are a lot of scholarships out there and there's a lot of money out there. And if you want to be able to find the best scholarships for you, because there's so many, the sooner you can start, the better. Start looking at some of those scholarship search sites, look at the criteria that fits you best, and find scholarships you're interested in and start keeping track on a spreadsheet. Where do you apply for that scholarship? What's the maximum award you can get? What kinds of materials do you have to get together? Are you going to have to write an essay? Do you have to get your transcripts ready? Do they need your test scores? Those kinds of things. Keep a spreadsheet and start keeping that organized so that when the time comes, you fill out your FAFSA, you fill out your CSS, and you start filling out those scholarship applications as soon as they open so that you have access to more money. You don't want to be sitting there November of your senior year desperately searching for scholarships and then trying to rush everything through. If you've spent time earlier during freshman, sophomore, junior years kind of compiling a list, you can look for new stuff out there as a senior, but you've got a list of a lot of good options for you, and you can just start getting your stuff together early so that you're ready to go when the time comes. It's a lot less stressful. High school counselors, if you go to your high school counseling office, they often have a lot of information about scholarships. In particular, a lot of times your high school will have information about scholarships that local employers offer, those kinds of things that aren't necessarily well advertised other places. So it's a good idea to stop by your high school counseling office at some point and start looking at what scholarships are available. College scholarships as well. Again, some colleges do not offer merit aid. Other colleges offer a lot of merit aid. So again, if you've been researching your colleges and you've narrowed your list down to 10 or 20, go to those colleges' websites, find their financial aid and scholarship offices, and start looking. What are their deadlines? What kind of scholarships do they offer? Get a sense of what's available to you early. And then you'll know also in advance how generous those schools typically are in terms of merit aid for students. It might help you make a decision. Do you want to keep that school on your list? Do you want to remove that school from your list? Maybe move up a different school instead, depending on what they offer. So I'll give you an example. Oberlin College, they're in Ohio. They're a private liberal arts college. It's a very selective institution academically. So their students typically have very good grades. In 2019-2020, their tuition was almost $57,000 a year. But they offered merit aid to almost half of the students they admitted that year. And their average merit offer was $17,000, just short of $17,000. So that's a fair bit of money. That takes a huge chunk off. They're also fairly generous with their need-based aid. So even though we might look at the tuition and think, oh my gosh, that's crazy high tuition per year, most people don't pay anywhere near that tuition. A lot of private institutions have very generous financial aid packages. So a number of students who apply to both public and private institutions, particularly if they have very good grades, are surprised when they get financial aid letters and realize that they can go to a private institution that charges almost $60,000 a year in tuition for less money than a state school in the neighboring state. So that's also something to keep in mind. Private institutions are typically a lot more expensive, but they also offer a lot more financial aid as a general rule. So your actual sticker price might not be anywhere near what the tuition is. So keep that in mind. Private foundations. A lot of private foundations offer all kinds of scholarships. So the Flynn Foundation provides a lot of money to students. Additionally, just like National Merit Scholarships, students who get Flynn money, there are a number of colleges and universities, if you can get awarded Flynn money, will offer you a more generous package because you're a Flynn scholar. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And there are a few private foundation scholarships that are like that, where colleges and universities will offer better packages to students who can get some of that private money. The Ford Foundation, Ford Scholars, you can get a lot of money from the Ford Foundation as well. Coca-Cola Scholars, they give quite a lot of tuition money every year to students. So a lot of these private foundations give a lot of money. The next one is the United Negro College Fund. So they also provide a lot of funding for students. The American Indian College Fund provides a lot of money. Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, started the Jackie Robinson Foundation with his wife. They funded it very generously, and they provide a lot of financial aid for students. And all of these private foundations, the money they give, it's all grants and scholarships. So students don't have to pay back any of that money. Understanding awards, that's kind of one of the things that's really important. Unfortunately, there's no standardization in terms of financial aid. So what happens is you apply to 5 schools, maybe you get accepted to all of them, and you get 5 financial aid letters. And they all look really different. And they call the same things by different names. So some of them will separate out federal subsidized loans versus federal unsubsidized loans, and others won't. They'll just lump student loans together. Others will separate line by line every type of merit aid. Others will group it in a lump sum. Some, when they offer packages, will put anything that's a grant or scholarship together in a specific dollar amount, and then have loans you have to pay back and work study. But they don't separate out all the different types of scholarships you may have qualified for. You just see it as a lump sum. So you lay out your letters and you're trying to compare your aid, and it's very, very difficult to compare the best offer. And even though they all at the end kind of give you your bottom line, here's what tuition is, here's what you get, here's what you're going to have to pay, and they all do that. The problem is you can't really compare the here's what you're going to have to pay, because you're not comparing apples to apples, because some of those offers might only include grants and scholarships. So they might be telling you you have to pay $20,000 a year, but all the aid they're giving you, and you don't have to pay any of it back. And the next offer over says you're going to only pay $12,000 a year in tuition. And at first it looks better, but kind of hidden in there is they've given you so much money in student loans, you're going to be paying back $15,000 worth of student loans every year. In which case you're paying $12,000 plus $15,000 plus interest on the $15,000, which is not a better deal than the $20,000 a year. So it's important to really look at those letters carefully and separate out what is the school offering you that you don't have to pay back, and what are they offering you that you do have to pay back. Because anything they're offering you that you do have to pay back, that's money you're paying. So you kind of need to add that back in to what you're paying, because even if you're not paying it now, you're paying it later, and you're paying it later with interest. So ideally, as you're applying for college and you're applying for financial aid, the best case scenario is to get a bunch of need-based and merit-based and or athletic aid that does not have to be paid back. You do not want a lot of student loans that you have to pay back with interest, because that adds up. It gets really expensive really fast, and you find yourself making the equivalent of a house payment on student loans 10 years after you graduated, and that's not what we want. Now, that having been said, you look at your offer letters, and maybe a school is saying they're going to give you $15,000, $20,000 a year in student loans. But if you can apply for private scholarships and get $30,000 a year in private scholarships, you don't have to take the student loans. You can go to that school, not take the student loans, and end up going with perhaps all your tuition, room, and board taken care of between the aid they offer you and your private scholarships. So that's not a problem. Those are still options for students. Keep in mind, though, also when you're applying for private scholarships and you're adding that in, what you've been awarded, to kind of figure out what school will really cost you. Some scholarships are assuming, for example, you keep your grades up, or if you're applying for a STEM scholarship, you keep a STEM major, so you can't change your major to art or French or something like that and keep your STEM scholarship. But if you continue to meet the criteria for grades, major, whatever it is, that money continues for 4 years until you graduate. There are other scholarships you apply and it's a one-time offer. So you might win a $10,000 scholarship, but that $10,000 scholarship you get for that next year of school. So you apply as a senior, you get it for your freshman year. It does not continue for your sophomore, junior, senior year. So you would have to continue to apply for that or other scholarships to make up the loss of that money the next 3 years of college. So keep that in mind as you're looking at scholarships. When you build your spreadsheet, make notes. Is it a scholarship that lasts all 4 years, or is it a one-time award? Because you need to know that when you're calculating out your actual cost of college. It's really important, because you don't want to be relying on that scholarship money for full 4 years. If you're only going to get it the first year, you need to know up front it's just 1 year, so that you can plan on applying for other scholarships in future years to make that up. So that's something that's really, really important to make sure you do that. What kinds of requirements are there if it is a recurring scholarship? Is it just a GPA requirement? Is it a major requirement? Is it both? Do you have to do a certain amount of community service to keep the scholarship? Every private scholarship is a little bit different. So know what those requirements are for the money to keep coming in, and make sure you're prepared to fulfill those requirements so that the money keeps coming. If you do get a STEM scholarship and you change your major, and the scholarship requires you to be a STEM major, you'll lose that money, but it was a scholarship, and they will not make you pay back the money they gave you when you were, say, an electrical engineering major. So if you change from electrical engineering to marketing, you're going to lose the scholarship for future years, but they're not going to take away or make you pay back what they previously gave you. But make sure as you're applying for scholarships that you keep that in mind, so you know exactly what that scholarship is offering. Again, will it continue? Is it a one-time offer? And they're all over the place. So you have to really check every single scholarship. And again, I can't stress enough, when you start looking, just use Google Sheets, Excel, whatever works for you. Start a spreadsheet, keep track. When does the application open? When does it close? What kinds of things do you need to get together to submit? Are you going to have to write an essay? Does the scholarship recur? What's the minimum and maximum you can get? All those kinds of things. The sooner you can get that together, the easier it is for you to sort of figure out your financial aid situation. Another thing to consider is the value of the school and your potential job prospects when you graduate. So, for example, if you are majoring in something like chemical engineering, there's a certain salary you might expect when you come out with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering degree in chemical engineering. You can take into consideration what that expected salary will be, and you can go to like Glassdoor, Indeed, places like that online, and get a pretty good idea. You can do a search for entry-level salaries in a variety of professions. And you can get an idea of what the entry-level salary is, say, for a chemical engineer in a particular state or region. You can consider that when you're figuring out what you're willing to pay for college. So after you've looked at all your financial aid offer letters and how much money different schools expect you to pay, you might be willing to take out $15,000 a year in student loans to get a chemical engineering degree from MIT, because you can expect to make six figures almost immediately upon graduation. So that might be worth it to you. You might think, okay, I can deal with that. On the other hand, you may not think you're willing to take out $15,000 a year in student loans to get a bachelor's degree in education to be an elementary school teacher. Because odds are good, no matter what state you're in, you're not going to be making anywhere near the kind of money the new chemical engineering graduate is making. And $15,000 per year in student loans over the course of your 4 years, $60,000 in student loans is probably more money than you're going to make your first year as a teacher in a lot of states. So in that case, it might not be worth it to you at all to take on that kind of debt. You might be willing to go to your third or fourth choice school because they give you a better financial aid package, and you can graduate and get a job as a teacher and not have any student loan debt. So that's something else you really want to consider when you look at what you're going to have to pay for college, whether it be money you and your parents have to come up with out of pocket, or student loan money you have to take out to make up the difference. You really need to consider that. What are my job prospects when I graduate? What kind of money am I expected to make when I graduate? And is this amount of money I'm paying into college or potentially taking on as debt worth it based on what I'm expected to make in the future? And for every person, depending on your major, it's going to be a little bit different. In some cases, for example, though, if you really want to be a teacher and you have the opportunity to go to a really prestigious institution, but it's going to be a little bit expensive, if you're willing to work in underserved communities for your first few years as a teacher, there are government programs where they will write off your student loans if you do that. So if you're a student that really wants to go to this very expensive school, your financial aid package isn't ideal, but you're willing to do something like work in an underserved community as a teacher or a nurse or something like that, depending on what major you picked, you can kind of consider those sorts of things as well. But definitely consider those things. Are you willing to work in some of those underserved communities to get some of that debt written off? Are you willing to take on debt, and how much debt are you willing to take on, depending on your major and how much money you're expected to make in the future? Another thing you really want to consider is, are you planning to go to graduate school? What is that going to cost you? And what's the likelihood of you getting aid for those sorts of things? Because you may decide, for example, okay, I'm going to major in physics, and then I'm going to get a PhD in physics. If that's your goal, you can kind of expect that you're going to pay for your undergraduate education. You're going to get out of school with a Bachelor of Science in Physics, and you're going to apply to PhD programs. Most PhD programs in any kind of STEM field, for example, they give very good aid packages to their PhD students. They're very selective. They don't take that many PhD students. They will do all kinds of things. They will give you, if they're a public institution, out-of-state tuition waivers. They will often give you in-state tuition waivers to also cover that portion of tuition. They will give you research assistant opportunities, teaching assistant jobs, those kinds of things, and pay you money. So for a lot of PhD students, particularly in STEM fields, they go off to graduate school, and really they don't have to pay for anything except their living expenses, except the university has given them a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship and is paying them. That pretty much pays their living expenses. So you can get a PhD in a lot of the sciences, engineering, math, virtually free. So if that's your plan, you can kind of expect you're paying for your undergraduate education, but odds are really good your graduate education will be free or nearly free. On the other hand, if you're thinking, okay, I'm going to go through my undergrad, I'm going to major in whatever, because you can go to medical school, and as long as you take the prereqs, you can major in anything you want. I'm going to major in philosophy, and then I'm going to go to medical school. You have to kind of calculate what money are you paying for your undergraduate degree, and then how much money is medical school going to cost you. And a lot of medical schools are pushing $100,000 a year tuition, and they don't give you tuition waivers. So if you want to go to medical school, now there are some need-based scholarships, there are some merit scholarships, but for a lot of students, a huge chunk of their medical education is paid for by either you're very lucky and have very wealthy parents, or a really generous grandparent who forks over the money, or more often than that, student loans. So that's something you want to consider. Do you really want to graduate with an undergraduate degree with $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in student loan debt, knowing you're going to now accumulate another $300,000+ of student loan debt for medical school? So those are the kinds of things you want to really think about. So maybe if you're in that situation where you're anticipating going to medical school, law school, veterinary school, dental school, those kinds of things that are fairly expensive, and unlike PhD programs, don't really pay you to be there. You want to consider maybe you go to the less expensive undergraduate option, even if it is your second choice, fifth choice, eighth choice school. Because even if it's your eighth choice school in your list of 10 schools that you'd be happy at, you've still identified this as a school you'll be happy at. So maybe it's not the first choice school that would make you the happiest, but you can go to school 4 years, be happy, and graduate debt-free, so that when you go and have to take on debt for medical school or dental school or whatever it is, you're not panicking at the horror of the situation just getting worse and worse and worse. So that's kind of one of those things you really want to consider, is how much debt do you want to take on relative to future debt you're going to have to take on for grad school and future salary. So that's kind of one of those things you really need to consider. A lot of students who are interested in things like medical school and dental school kind of go the route of, okay, I've looked up salaries for different physician specialties or dentists, orthodontists, that kind of thing, and it's pretty high, so I don't care if I have $300,000 or $400,000 worth of debt. But you also need to consider, so you've graduated with your undergraduate degree, you go to medical school, you have this much debt, and now you want to be a physician and you want to set up a practice. So now you have to pay all kinds of fees to be a legal business. You have to pay malpractice insurance. You have to buy or rent a building You have to put a ton of expensive equipment in that building so that you can actually do your job as a physician. So now you're taking on a ton more debt to buy all that equipment. So you kind of get where I'm going with this. You can't just assume you're going to graduate from medical school and make $400,000 a year and not have a whole bunch of other debts so that you can make the $400,000 a year. So keep that in mind. You may have debts after school to set up a practice, depending on what graduate specialty you chose. So that's something that is really important to consider when you're trying to figure out what you should be paying for your education. What I would say is look at the cost of college, not just as an actual dollar amount cost, but what is the value of that degree to you? And when you calculate the value, you really have to look at what's the likelihood I'll be employed pretty quickly? What kind of salary can I expect over what period of time? Because that's going to make a huge difference in terms of what you're willing to pay. Most students, fair or not, tend not to make as much money as teachers as they do in certain other professions like engineering. So engineering students might be willing to pay more or take on more debt than an education student. So it really is kind of one of those things you want to think about. And I'm not saying if you'd really like to be a teacher to not major in education, but consider what teachers get paid and factor that in to what you're willing to pay for college and what kind of debt or not you're willing to take on, because that's really important. Tuition Fit. They are an NCSA partner. So if you have a recruiting profile with the Next College Student Athlete, they periodically do webinars with NCSA. And you can go to tuitionfit.org and they have a whole lot of information for you about figuring out the real cost of college and figuring out whether or not your award letter is a good one. They have a lot of stuff they offer for free. You can pay a one-time fee and they give you access to a lot more information. That one was started by a guy who spent a lot of time working in higher ed and really wanted to help kids figure out whether or not they were getting good financial aid packages and what those were really worth. And so he's got a ton of information. And one of the things that Tuition Fit does is they will block out personally identifying information, but students who are applying to college will upload their financial aid offer letters to Tuition Fit. So if you've applied to 10 colleges, you get into 8, you have 8 offer letters, you upload them to Tuition Fit. They remove your personally identifying information and they put that into their system. Other kids can search and find the schools they're interested in, and some of them might be schools you applied to, and they can find kids with similar expected family contributions, that kind of thing, and compare the offer letter they got to these other offer letters and to the average that students at that school get offered. And you can do the same thing. So you're uploading your documents, but you're also comparing your offers to what other students have uploaded. So they've got a lot. I can't even begin to guess how many. But students upload so many offer letters all the time. And they provide information like what was their expected family contribution, that sort of thing. It's on the offer letters as well in many cases. And again, Tuition Fit removes any personally identifying information, but it's really helpful because you can go in there and look and see, is this particular institution giving me a really good offer? So we had the Oberlin College example, and almost 50% of the students they admit get offered merit aid. And the average award is $17,000, just under $17,000. So if you happen to apply to Oberlin and you get an offer letter and there's no merit aid, it's probably not a very good offer. On the other hand, if you apply to Oberlin, you get accepted, they send you an offer letter, and they're offering you $30,000 of merit aid that's a really good offer because it's significantly higher than the average. And so you can find those kinds of things through Tuition Fit, and you can see, am I getting a good offer? Is this a good deal? But they will also do things like compare different colleges. So take Arizona, for example. Arizona State University, University of Arizona, and Northern Arizona University are all Arizona Board of Regents public state-funded institutions, and the tuition at all three of them is different, and the amount of financial aid and how it's offered at all three of those institutions is different. So you could apply to ASU, U of A, and NAU as an in-state student and get very different tuition, expected family contribution, here's your need, here's the offer, this is what we're going to give you. And it can be very different at three public institutions in the same state. And it's not just Arizona. Public institutions in Illinois, Michigan, North Carolina, they don't offer the same rate. So it's very different. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. And you can look at that on Tuition Fit. You can see maybe you applied to one particular school in Illinois, for example, and you come back and you're searching through Tuition Fit and you realize that another school in Illinois, 20 miles down the road, tends to be $3,000 a year cheaper for most students. Maybe you want to consider applying there if it's a school that you check out and you realize, hey, that might be a really good fit for me. So keep those kinds of things in mind as well. So Tuition Fit's a really good option for students to use. Again, they have a lot of stuff that's free. It's kind of another model really where it's that freemium kind of setup where you can pay to have access to more, but there's a lot of information they offer free. The second link under Tuition Fit that's on the screen, that is from a recent webinar that they did in partnership with NCSA that they were nice enough to post on YouTube that anyone can watch. So feel free to take a screenshot or whatever and check out that video. They talk about how Tuition Fit works and how it can benefit you. It's about 45 minutes before they get into kind of some Q&A stuff. But I would recommend looking at that and seeing kind of how it works, because that's a really good place to go to get a lot of information about what is the real cost of college and how to look at the value of a college education so that you're not paying too much and you're not ending up in a situation where you have a lot of debt or you thought you had a good offer and it turns out not to be such a great offer because scholarships aren't renewing and you didn't know that, those kinds of things. Because we don't want to be in a situation where we have a student who picks a great school, they're really happy, and halfway through their freshman year, they realize, oh my gosh, all my financial aid is going away at the end of a year. I didn't realize it doesn't renew. And then you're trying to get through school. And if you're playing lacrosse, for example, now we're in the spring and it's lacrosse season, and you're trying to do well in school, do well in lacrosse, and figure out how you can apply for a ton of other scholarships. And many of them, the deadlines have already passed to make up for the scholarship money you're losing for the next year. So we don't want students to be in that situation. We'd rather you take the time, you kind of figure out up front what your situation is, what renews, what doesn't, so you know going in exactly what this is going to cost you and whether or not you're going to have to keep reapplying for aid. And again, if you've narrowed down your list of colleges to 10 or 20, and you can start looking at those colleges' financial aid websites and scholarship sites, those folks are really helpful. You can even call those offices and talk to financial aid officers, and they will help you kind of understand what sorts of financial aid packages they typically offer students. They can give you a wealth of information. They're also very helpful if you have difficulty with the FAFSA. So for example, with that federal financial aid form, you have to provide a lot of information. And one of the things students you need to be aware of, in order for full consideration for federal financial aid, you have to put in information on your parents' income, tax returns, that kind of thing. Most parents will help fill that out with you and provide that information, knowing that it's necessary for the estimated family contribution and for you to be eligible for a variety of need-based aid. There are some parents that absolutely will not provide that information. And if you're in one of those situations, knowing the financial aid officers at a couple of schools you're interested in can be very, very helpful, because they can really sort of walk you through what other options you have and what else they might be able to do for you, depending on your particular situation. So that's kind of one of those things to keep in mind too. And when you talk to financial aid officers, you're covered under FERPA, the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And the financial aid officers take that very seriously. So they don't share your personal information, your family's financial information with anyone. But they can be really helpful, especially if it's, if you've got a few schools that are your top choices and those financial aid officers know, and you tell them, hey, this school is one of my top choices. I'm really trying to figure out how I can make this work. They're very helpful with students, letting you know what kinds of options you have. With the FAFSA, another thing besides needing some financial information from your parents, they will ask you a series of questions. And it's one thing, there's a lot of misconceptions about the process. And there have been a number of parents who, a couple of years before their child has been getting ready to apply to college, what they do is they decide they're going to suck up the loss of the deduction on their federal income taxes, and they're not going to claim their child as a dependent, so that when their child is applying for college and applies for financial aid, they're not a dependent. And that's an absolute myth. It doesn't work that way. If you do that, or your parents do that, all they're doing is giving up the deduction on their taxes, and they're getting nothing in return. Your parents can not claim you on your taxes, on their taxes, for 10 years, and you're still their dependent for financial aid purposes for college. So when they ask you the series of questions, it's very difficult for young people getting out of high school to not be a dependent. You're not a dependent if you are living on your own and married. If you are living on your own and not married, you're still your parents' dependent, with very few exceptions. So if you're married, then you don't need your parents' information on the form and you're considered independent. If you're in military service, and that doesn't count things like reserves or National Guard, if you're in full-time active duty military service, or are now out of full-time active duty military service, you're not considered a dependent of your parents. That's kind of a benefit you get for serving your country. If you're over 24, you're not considered a dependent of your parents in most cases. But again, most kids who want to play sports in college are in high school and they're planning this ahead, and you're not waiting till you're 25 to apply to college. So there are some exceptions like that. If you're filling out the FAFSA because you're going to earn a doctoral degree, you're not considered dependent of your parents, but that's because you already have a bachelor's degree. Most of those kids are older than 24 or close to 24 by then anyway. So keep that in mind as well. If people have been telling you or your parents, oh, just don't claim your kid the last couple of years before they apply to college, and then your income doesn't count, only their income, and they won't be your dependent, not true. I hate when students come and say that that's what they were told and their parents didn't take a deduction. It's absolutely not true. Your parents can fail to claim you for years, and you go fill out that FAFSA and you're their dependent, whether they claimed you or not. So keep that in mind. Don't give up the tax deduction, parents, thinking that your kid will not be considered your dependent for college financial aid. They will. So take the deduction And when they apply for college, they're going to need some financial information. The form is handled a little bit differently. If your parents are divorced, you typically provide the financial information of the parent you live with most of the year, which may not be the parent who claimed you on their taxes, depending on how a divorce decree was done. But again, if you go to studentaid.gov, where the FAFSA is, they have all kinds of documents to help support. And there's all sorts of handouts that we have on federal financial aid that I'll be sending to everyone tomorrow to kind of help with that when you get ready to go for those sorts of things. But the FAFSA folks are really good at helping kids. You just call them and they'll help you figure out, do you need your mom's information or your dad's information or both? Those kinds of things, and they're really good about it. And again, financial aid officers, if you have some sort of problem, unique situation, they'll help you with that as well. So keep that in mind. There's this Decoding the Cost of College I have up here. There's a report called Decoding the Cost of College that looks at how these offer letters are so different and talks about how to compare them and ways to make it easier for students. So that's another document I'll send to you with your handouts so that you can get a sense, since they break down what some of these terms mean on these offer letters. So it can help you if you kind of hang on to it when you start applying and you start getting offer letters. It can help you kind of figure out what some of these things might mean that you find on your offer letter. Because sometimes they spell it out and other times they just abbreviate things and you're looking at your offer letter. You're like, I have no idea what any of this means. And you're trying to figure out what's what. So that document can help with that quite a lot. That's kind of the nuts and bolts actually of financial aid. It's a lot of information, I know, in a short period of time. But if anyone has any questions, you can, again, use the chat. Type up whatever question you might have, and I'll try and answer it to the best of my ability. And if you don't have any questions, then we'll close out. And then for those of you who registered for this seminar and got the Zoom link sent to them, I have your email. I will send you all the handouts tomorrow. Those of you who might be on through our YouTube or Twitch live feed, if you have not registered, go to southmountainlax.com/college-prep or send an email to southmountainlax@gmail.com so that I've got your email and I will send you the handouts. But if I don't have your email, I can't send you any handouts. So either go to southmountainlax.com/college-prep and register for the workshop, or just send me a quick email, southmountainlax@gmail.com, and I will send you all of the handouts and worksheets from tonight. Any questions? Okay, looks like everyone's good on financial aid. So if anyone has any questions later, feel free again to send me an email and ask. And again, I'll send out all the handouts and worksheets and all that fun stuff tomorrow. And thanks for joining us again. And we'll do more workshops later. We'll run this series at least once a year for kids. So if you have friends later that are having all kinds of problems figuring out applying, figuring out recruiting profiles, figuring out financial aid, whatever, send them to our website and they can register for upcoming workshops. So thanks again, everyone, for being with us. And this was the last of our workshop series. So we'll send you notifications when we do more. Thanks.